Hello and welcome to this, the final in our series looking at the world of Ireland's Olympians in an Olympics year that we could never have imagined. The best person to finish off with, perhaps, is the person who has been responsible, in part at least, for the way that we approach things in our minds as opposed to our bodies. A very warm welcome to Kate Kirby, who is the head of psychology at the Sport Ireland Institute and for the past year has been the lead psychologist with Team Ireland. Hello, Kate.
Hey, Rob. How are you? Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you join us. Tell me something. We've spoken to athletes, we've spoken to those behind the scenes about how they've coped with the changes that have been wrought on our sporting calendar over the course of the pandemic. Is it something that people could have been prepared for, or is this the ultimate test of where sports psychology and human psychology actually leads us?
Well, certainly I didn't feel prepared for it, and there was no psychological template that I was operating from. When I was advising athletes, a lot of it was just done on the fly and trying to see commonalities across sports and what was working for people in how they were responding and what was causing people to struggle. So for sure at the start, it was all just information gathering and trying to plot a path that would help people. A few people drew analogies for athletes in being injured and kind of being removed from your sport and at a distance from it. But for me, there was huge differences psychologically for athletes being injured and not being allowed to train for COVID, because when you're injured, you have the anxiety that all your other competitors are still competing and getting a leg up on you, whereas they all hit the red light at the same time pretty much, and you could see globally it was going around the countries and the continent. So the idea of being injured, while both had a physical impact of not allowing people to train, psychologically it's quite different. So even that model that some people were operating off, for me, it just wasn't a fit.
So that essence of we're all in this together would have been particularly so in such an uber competitive world of sport.
Yeah, I think so. And, I guess I was in a relatively fortunate position where, because I work across so many sports in my role in the Institute and with the Olympics. So I was just doing a quick talk this morning, and I'm kind of heavily involved in rowing, sailing, athletics, hockey, and modern pentathlon. And then I have one or two athletes from smaller sports like badminton, gymnastics, swimming, and para swimming. So being in touch with all those athletes across all those various sports, I was actually able to see a lot of kind of threads of things that were helping people in other sports, and then bringing it back and saying, look, this is working really well for sailing. Maybe it's something you could consider. And that sharing of information across sports was something that for me was of more value than ever during COVID, when people were quite isolated. So I tried to do a lot of that early on, as did Jessie Barr, the other psychologist on the Institute team. And we tried to kind of plot trends that would help the performance directors and coaches and athletes identify ways forward.
That is great, being able to draw on, as you say, the commonalities. Was there a difference between those who were involved in the team sports, like the hockey team, for example, that you would have been working closely with, and those who were in more individual pursuits, like the swimmers and the runners and the athletes, who would be perhaps more self-contained in their normal course of training?
There were some differences, but like pretty much everyone struggled at times with motivation, and that was the thing we identified as the biggest risk factor and the biggest challenge. Were athletes who were fine some days and then other days had no incentive to train, and that really seemed to be quite common, whether it was individual athletes or team athletes. And we were able to trace that back to, I suppose, the idea of self-determination theory is there are three conditions necessary in order for people to feel motivated. One is a sense of autonomy or control, which had been completely removed for these athletes. The second is a feeling of competence. And when competition is removed, or when you're just training on your own, doing running sessions in your garden, that feeling of competence is removed. And for me, the biggest one at this time was the lack of connection with people. And that affected individual athletes, but probably that was the one that affected the team athletes even more, who pretty much always train in groups. Whereas we would have some individual athletes who do quite a lot of their training on their own, and that lack of connection wasn't as big a change to their day-to-day life as it was for the team sports.
It is, I guess, harder to judge yourself racing against a shed than it is a training partner or a competitor. And in terms of that motivation, was there something that held elite sporting people aside? Because everybody would have struggled with that. Everybody in a work environment, in a home environment, we were dealing with things that we had never had to deal with before. Some thrived, some really struggled with it. But sports stars, we praise for the levels of resilience and the level of absolute focus and dedication. Did that come into play?
I saw a lot of reporting in the media about how awful it was for elite athletes and the struggles they were having with their mental health. And for me, that really didn't ring true with what I was seeing on the ground. I felt like a lot of our athletes coped really well. They had the advance notice, so they put structures in place. They had gym equipment at home. They moved to a place where they had space to train. A number of them relocated. So, you would have had, like the rowers went back to Skibbereen and Paul and Gary lived together. And, you would have had likewise other kind of the sailors who were sailing in a boat together moved in together so they could train together once they were allowed back on the water. So they were quite good at adjusting their situation to match the conditions that prevailed. But, I suppose like everyone else, they did struggle. But the one thing they would have said also is that the removal of a lot of the socializing, which is what normal people struggled with, and having events to look forward to and going to the pub on a Saturday night, that's not the norm for them. So living quite a monastic lifestyle where there just isn't a whole lot going on besides training, eating and sleeping wasn't that unusual for them. So a lot of them found the day-to-day tedium not as difficult to deal with as people who would be used to going into the office or, used to meeting up with friends and going out more.
Okay, so monks and Olympians, the boredom actually sort of came into their to play with their advantage. Yeah. Did it help a lot of them were engaged in charitable works and they had more time to actually devote to things that could be seen as being in that social good sphere? Do you think, is that something that will have benefited them in the long term, that they were able to actually come out of themselves a little bit more and not be so focused on, this particular muscle and that particular split time and everything that normally is the metric by which they judge themselves?
Yeah, I think so. Sinead mentioned it a lot in her interview with you, where she said it did give athletes time to pause and consider what else mattered to them outside of sport, and also, I suppose, to have more empathy with what's going on in the globally and even in their community. It did allow them to step back and not be so caught up in the minutiae of their sport and the hectic travel and competing that you're on all the time. And I think the one benefit was the creation of time for them to look at what was important in terms of planning for their post-sporting career, looking at going back to education, for example. And that's, again, one good thing that's come out of this is the advent of remote learning and the speedy progression of remote learning opportunities, which really suits Olympic athletes who are on the road so much. So I think study opportunities will be better for them as a result of this. And likewise, I think just, a lot of them were able to go back to work, and because everyone's working from home, they were able to do a couple of days a week from home. And that was really good for a lot of them psychologically, to have something else going on besides just training by themselves in their garden twice a day.
Yeah, Chloe Watkins was one, I think, who went back in and was working on the accountancy and just getting through the normal things of life, as well as preparing for an Olympics. Yeah. One of the things which has been evident throughout the different phases as we begin to recover is the fact that some people have actually found it harder moving into this kind of limbo land between what was a complete lockdown and everyone in it together to a position now where, well, we're not sure. Are we actually, are we going too easy or are we going too hard? Is that something which is going to cause a challenge within those sporting minds, in terms of the benefit being that if we know everybody else is off their training schedule, then we're fine?
Yeah.
But now we're at a point where different countries, different parts of the world are all moving at a different pace.
Yeah, I think it definitely is. And it was funny, you know, we spent the whole time during strict lockdown with the 2K and the 5K restrictions, like wishing that things opened up. And I noticed a trend when things opened up that people were actually slightly disappointed. They'd kind of gotten used to the status quo and accepted it. And the clarity that it provided, like you said, was almost reassuring, going, okay, this is what I'm allowed to do. And there's no gray area at the moment. And as things opened up and people, you know, became less sure of what was okay, that definitely created a degree of anxiety, and people have different levels of tolerance for what's okay. So even the first time you're going back into your training environment or back meeting your teammates, you know, you're not sure, like, should we be bumping elbows to say hello? Or, you know, there's definitely an awkwardness as each kind of progression of the restrictions being eased comes along. But also, like you said, now the differentials among different countries and different continents, you know, that has been kind of infuriating for athletes in a way. You know, you can see our swimmers, for example, were waiting for a long time to get back in the pool, and they could see that, you know, there was dispensations allowed for Olympic athletes in Germany the whole way through who had access to Olympic training centres. And, you know, again, you know, you were looking at, it came slower in South America. So people, you know, were business as usual in South America, and our opposition were training away while we were on really strict lockdown. And that comparison is definitely still ongoing. And now, as we're, you know, countries like Australia are entering phase 2, it's come full circle again, where they had the freedom while we didn't have it, and now it's changed. So I think that's going to be something that we'll just have to accept, that it's going to be swings and roundabouts, and you just have to trust that it will equalize over time.
And as we move now into the next phase of preparation for the Olympics, 1 year on, physically people will be slightly different. They'll all be a year older. Some that will benefit, some that will take away from. Is the world in which you're operating, that world of psychology and the mind of the sporting person, is that going to be more important now over the next 12 months than it would have been even going into 2020? And I know that it's a science which has really found its feet within sport, but I get a feeling that 2021 is going to be ever more important.
Yeah, look, I think there are a number of things. One is that the importance of actually just living day to day and living in the moment has become even further increased, because, you know, there's so much speculation about, even now going back to school, what's going to happen, or with the resumption of international competition, and will colleges be going back? And you could spend your whole life speculating about that, and it, you know, it's fortune telling. It's a waste of time, essentially. So for athletes to be able to just go and give their best to every session and just live in each day, with the assumption that the games are going ahead, will be really important. And engaging in that idle speculation really adds no value for them. And I suppose the vehicle by which we enhance that skill of living in the moment and day to day is mindfulness. And a lot of athletes have used that during the lockdown and continue to use it, both for the relaxation benefits, but also just the ability to be more self-aware and recognize when their kind of mind is wandering off into the future. And then the other thing, which we had already done a lot of work in at the start of this year in terms of Olympic specific preparation, is dealing with the games and all the curveballs it throws up, and, you know, accepting that you can't control things at the Olympics. You're essentially a small fish in a big pond, and I think that again will be even more important in 2021, because we were operating off a template of knowing pretty much what the games are like from cycle to cycle. So we know what to expect in the village, we know how things run, we know how accreditations work, how security checks work. All of that is gone. We don't know how it's going to work. And, you know, their idea of the reduced games, you know, nobody has any idea of how that will look. So working on that skill of just being able to be psychologically flexible and accept that, you know, you turn up and things will be the way they are, and you just have to put that aside and perform to the best of your ability without letting all the extraneous circumstances get in the way and frustrate you.
Okay, you wouldn't say it, but I'm allowed to call you a guru of, shall we say, visualization. And one of the questions which has been a recurring theme through this series has been asking the athletes to visualize where they're going to be this time next year on the side of a pool. And all of them have taken that on board, and they very much see where they're going to be and how they're going to get there as being an important part as twitch muscle reflexes and everything else. To round off the series, I can't avoid asking the question of you. How are you visualizing yourself in Tokyo a little under a year away from now?
I have not done a huge amount of it, to be honest, because of that idea of that, if it's a tailored down games, I don't know where my role will be and where my position will sit. So I guess how I see it is just delivering sport individually to the athletes and systemically to the team. However the circumstances allow me to do that. So whether that's face to face, whether I'm there, or whether it's remotely on Zoom, as I have been doing for the last 5 months, I know I'll be a part of it, and I know I'll have a skill set to offer to help them prepare, but I don't know where I'll be or how it will look. So I'm trying, unlike an athlete who knows, they know if they're racing a 100-meter or 200-meter swimming race, what that will look like. Whatever the Olympic Village looks like, they know they'll be standing on the blocks in a pool and they'll have to swim 2 lengths or 4 lengths in their lane, executing their stroke. So the variables in terms of how they perform their role are not, they're quite clear when it comes to competition. For me, the variables on how I deliver my role at the games are a total unknown at the moment. So I guess I need to adapt that idea of being psychologically flexible as well.
Well, no better person, I'm sure. It has been excellent talking to all of those who are going to make the Olympics happen. We just have to hope that that will be the case. But as you've said, we don't know yet. It's lovely to finish with that honest reflection on the fact that we've come through this phase of the Games preparation in okay shape. Now we've got a little under 12 months to prepare, and no doubt you've been a brilliant crutch for everybody to lean on over the course of this period of time. Never more so than now. And thank you for taking the time out of your day, Kate Kirby, to chat with us today.
Thanks, Rob.